So yesterday's class we discussed like what is the project structure of React.js and what are the different folders and files that are created in React like this. Now let's see components in React. When we take React, it supports so two types of components. What are they means? They are functional components and second one class components. Functional components and class components. First, when we see the functional components here, so these are JavaScript functions created according to ES standard. So they specify what the content to be rendered onto the page. Whatever the data we want to display onto the page, they will specify. So how a functional component looks like means they can be written like this. Function, any function we can use. Normal function, anonymous function, arrow function, lambda function, anything we can use. Function, for that function, we can assign some name. And the functional components, they will take a special parameter called props as parameter. And inside the return statement, whatever the data to be rendered onto the web page, we will write inside. The data to be rendered onto the page, whatever the content we want to display on the page, will written inside this statement. So functional components actually, these components, they are also called, what are they? Stateless functional components. What is a state? I'll discuss it later like this. The next thing here, it is class components. So class components, actually we can call them these components. They are also called stateful class components. The state is the data that is maintained inside the component. So because the state is not maintained inside the functional component, we call them stateless. State is used inside the class component. That's why we call stateful. So any JavaScript class which extends React.component. In the React library, there is a class provided that is component class. So it is treated as a class component. That particular class, it is treated as a class component here. That to behave as a class component, it should extend the class called component class of React library. So how it is defined means the syntax will be something like class, some class name, extends React.component. And this contains a method called render. This contains a method called render. In this render method, whatever the data we want to render onto the page, whatever the data we want to display onto the page, we will write inside the render method. Like how they are created, now see here. First one, working with functional components. Generally, what we'll do here, whatever the components we want to create, those components to save them, will create a folder there. That is the components folder. Inside the SRC folder, we'll create the components folder. And then we'll create a JavaScript file named funcomp.js as below. To create a functional component, the code snippet RSF. Previously, I told you code snippets RSF, which stands for React Stateless Functional Component, will use. Now let's go to the folder here and project folder. Inside the SRC folder, we'll create a folder called components folder. And inside the components folder, we'll create the file funcomp.js. Generally, whatever the name we want to give for the component, the same name will be given for the file also. So now I will use the code snippet RSF React stateless function. Just it will create it as a normal function here. So this function, it takes a special parameter called props, and inside the return statement, whatever the content we want to render, we will write there. So now what we'll do? Just I'll take some H3 tag here, align equal to center. So just I'll write some statement. This is functional component. Just I'll write some statement. This is functional component like this. Now in our application, we have two components available. One is the root component app. Second one, the user defined component, functional component. Now let's try to save and run the application. When we run, it is displaying the app component. Actually, when we are running the application, it is displaying the app component only. So just I'll write inside, like this is app component. So it is loading and running the app component. But it is not showing the functional component. This text is not loaded. Why? Because when we run the application, what happens? Index.js, it will render the app component inside the index.html page. So because of that, it will load only the app.js file. But along with this app component, now I want to load this functional component also. But that functional component, it is not rendered onto the page. It is not rendered onto the page. So if we want to load the functional component also, then what we'll do? Suppose these the functional component we have created. Once it is done, what we have to do here? Render the functional component inside app component as below. So we have to open the app.js file, and inside this JS file, what we have to write there? We have to add the functional component. Once the functional component is loaded, so first index.html app component will be loaded. And while rendering the content of app component, because we have declared the functional component here, that component is also loaded from the browser. So whatever the HTML data it returns, that particular data, it is displayed on the page. We can see like this. First, we are seeing the app component. First, app is loaded. Inside the app component, functional component is loaded like this. Now, in this example, when we see, functional component is rendered inside app component. So because of that reason, app will behave as the parent component, and this component, funcom, it will behave as a child component. That's what we said in the hierarchy. App is the root element. Inside app, we are rendering the functional component. So in this example, app is the parent and funcomp is a child. So while loading the parent component, so because the child component is declared there, that component is also rendered, so that when we save and see the browser, we can see the content like this. So this is the way how exactly we can create a functional component like this. So you can create functional components in different ways. We can create functional components in different ways. Now let's see here. Creating a functional component as an anonymous function. Different type of functions we have declared. I want to create this component as an anonymous function. So not app component. We are not going to modify the app component. So this one, functional component. So what we'll do? Just we'll write something like this. Anonymous function, how to create? Constant, some name equals to, just use the function keyword. You can specify the props bit. So this function we are creating, a function without a name, we call it an anonymous function. Now, we will write here something like functional component as an anonymous function. Like this, I write. So that just save and refresh the page. The component has been created as an anonymous function. Any type, you can create the function as any type. So this is one way how we can create it. Next, suppose I want to create this function as an arrow function. Arrow function means how to create it. Arrow function. So how we create this function as an arrow function? Inside the progress. Inside the so arrow function means in between the parameter list and the function body, we will use the fat arrow symbol so that now this has been created as an arrow function. So that once we save and run. So functional component as an arrow function, it is displaying like this. Any type of function you can create. Now suppose assume that I want to create this function as a lambda function. Lambda function means no block, no return statement. Directly we can write the code. Of course, earlier we said if the code of that component is simple, so you can write the entire body in a single line. Declaration to definition, we can write in a single line like this. So now when the function is created like this, so we call it a lambda function here. A component can be created in any style. So different ways we have functions there. Any type of function, we can implement it. We can create the function in any style like this. So how to create functional components means these are the different ways how we can work with the functional components. Now, a functional component, it is defined to take some parameter called props as a value. So props is nothing but it is an object. This function, it takes an object called props as parameter. So this props, whatever we pass, those props we can access inside the function body. But the thing is, we can pass a set of parameters from a function. So where to pass these parameters? Where to pass these parameters? Now see here. Passing parameters to props object in a functional component. So how to pass the parameters? First step, we'll modify app component here. App component, while loading app component, it is loading the or it is rendering the contents of functional component also. So while rendering the functional component, here I can pass some parameters. So just what I will do, I will write something like this. So name equal to some name I will give. Subject equals to Java like this. So these are the values that we can pass while rendering a child component. While rendering a child component, a parent component, it can pass a set of values like this. So these values, they are assigned to the object called props. Object means how it will do. The attribute will become the property to which the value will be assigned. Subject Java like this. Now this is how the object looks like. So whatever the data that is sent through the parent component, it is rendered in the form of a props object like this. So props is the object means the attribute names will become the properties. The attribute values, they will become the property values. So like this, whatever the parameters we pass, we can declare here like this. Whatever the parameters we want to pass, just we can pass the parameters from parent component. Now, access the props object inside functional component as below. Now, these values we can access inside the functional component as below. In React.js, if we want to bind any data in React.js, if we want to bind any data, that data, it is binded inside curly braces like this. In React, if we want to bind the values of any variables, the variable values, they can be binded like this. So what I will do? To this props object, now two values are passed. One is a name, second one is a subject. So that's why what I will do, just I'll write like this. Prompts dot name is the faculty for props dot faculty for props dot subject like this. So this props, whatever the name attribute that is available, that name will be binded here. What is the value to assign to subject? It is binded here. So that when we run, the data will be binded like this. Suresh is a faculty of Java. Like that, whatever the values we pass, they are encapsulated into props object. And that object, a child component, it can access like this. Props dot name is a faculty for props dot subject. Like that we can.
So this name and faculty name and subject were given in parent and this props dot name is a faculty for props dot subject is given as child one.
No child one. You are getting those values from parent. Those values, they are encapsulated into props object. Whatever the values that are placed inside the props object, we are writing. We are
So
not
both are
declaring.
written in funcom dot JS.
That's what. So while rendering the fun component, it is passing a set of values. Those values, they are assigned in the form of props object here. So which component we are passing, only that component can access. That's how we can run. In this way, we can pass any number of values. Like I can invoke a component any number of times. So just I will write here. So .NET like this. Then I'll take like Python like this. Every time when the component is rendered, we'll get the data here like this. So props are the values that are passed as a parameter to a functional component. And those values, they can be rendered inside the page like this. Any number of times we can call, the components will be loaded. But only one time you have to call in the function. It will be rendered any number of times which will give in the page. Every time when you want to pass different values, you invoke the component multiple times. So like a HTML tag, H3 I am using multiple times with a different data. Every time when I call H3, the H3 tag will be binded. Like that, every time when we call functional component, whatever the values we pass, they are assigned to it. Different instances will be created. But one important thing we have to remember here, props are immutable. Props are immutable. So what it means? Immutable means immutable means we can say like they cannot be modified. Once the props were declared, they cannot be modified. So just for example, when we see here, the following code will display an error. Now we'll modify funcomp.js. Funcomp.js, what I will do? Before rendering the data, just I'll write like this, props.name equal to Ramesh. Props.subject equals to Python, something I have to type. Actually, the parent component is sending the values Suresh and Java, but here we are changing the values to Ramesh and Python. So that now when we run the page, you can see an error message, cannot assign to read-only property name of object hash. Hash means it is nothing but the props object. So whatever the props object we have, you cannot change the value for name. So because it is interpreted language, first it is showing for error for name property. Suppose if I have not changed name there, then when I run, it will show like this, cannot assign to read-only property subject. So once the props were defined, it will become a constant. So it cannot be changed. That's what we have to remember. So that is what here, save and run, so that we can see whatever the error it shows like this. So any JavaScript function, we can create it as a functional component like this. Okay, now suppose that I want to work with class components. Suppose that I want to work with the class components here. So how to work with class components? Now let's see. Create a JavaScript file named classcomp.js as below, where we will create it. Any component means it is created inside the components folder. So to create a class component, what is the code snippet means? RCC. Basic class means RCC, React class component. Of course, now I'll remove this one. So just I'll go to app.js, right click on components folder, new file. Any name you can give, no problem. But generally the component names, they are declared in Pascal case. Every word first letter is capital. Now we'll define RCC, different methods there. You can say RCJC. Just the class only it will create. Or I will say like RCFC, class component with the life cycle methods. Class components with life cycle methods. RCCP with the prop types, properties. So this render also, it will take default props object, that is just a class component skeleton only like this. So when we say RCC, it is creating like this, import React component. These are class available in the React library. So any class which is a subclass of this component class. It will behave as a class component. And this class component contains a method called render. Inside we'll specify what data to be rendered onto the page. What data to be rendered onto the page, we will write inside. So now just what I will do, I will take some h3 tag, align equal to center. Inside I will write like this a class component. Inside I'll write this a class component. Like this, I'll create a class. So once the class is created, now when I run the page, still it is printing the functional component on class component not rendered. So if I want to render the class component also, what I have to do? If I want to run the class component also, what we have to do there?
But this we have to call the function.
Yes. So declare the new component inside app component as below. So what we'll do here, just we'll go to app.js. Now I'll remove this. Inside I'll write class comp. So that now when we run, it will print here, this is a class component like this. Whatever the component we create, the component will be rendered like this. Once done, just save and run. Just save and run. The component will be run there here. Here also first what happens? First app component will be rendered. While loading the app component, the contents of the class component, they will also be loaded. That's what happens there. Okay, now class component also, it will take a default parameter called props. This is a default object provided to class component. Now let's see, passing props to a class component. Passing props to a class component. From where we have to pass the parent component, we have to pass the values. So that's why in app.js, what I will do, I will take something like ID 101, name Suresh, salary like this. Of course, according to XML standard, the values must be quoted. So these are, I'm rendering the class component there. While loading the class component, I'm passing a set of parameters to it. Now what we'll do, access the props inside class component as below. Just we can access the props inside the app component as below, class component. How to access them?
Using prompts.
So just we'll write here like employee details are,
Prompts.
take a BR tag. So props is the object which is available to class component. Class component member means we have to access using this keyword, this dot props dot ID. Then like this. So that when we run, the employee details are it will print like this. If required, you can print it as a table, whatever you want, you can write. So because props is the member of class component. So in the functional component, props is a local variable. Because props is a local variable, you are accessing directly inside the functional component. But here it is not the local member, props is the data member. Data member means we have to access it as this dot. Like that, we have to access it. This dot, we can access the members here like this. Once the members were accessed, just you can say save and run. We can run the application like this. If required, you can pass multiple data here while loading the components multiple times. So just I'll take different values, the data will be binded. So this is the way how we can work with class components like this. So while rendering the content, any data we want to pass, we can pass it. And here also, what are immutable. So for that, what we can do, just we'll modify class comp.js. We'll modify class comp.js. So inside the render method, I will write like this dot. I don't want to change all properties. I want to change name only. Any single attribute, it is not going to work. Cannot assign to read-only property name. So once the props are passed, they cannot be changed. That's what we have to do. So when we say just save and run, it will show an error message like this. Will show an error message like this. So that's it. They cannot be modified. Now, if required, you can call any component also. Like for example, here I want to call funcomp. But funcomp, we think it will take parameters set name and subject. So that's why what we'll do. Something. So we are calling both class component and functional components. Any component, the application may contain any number of components. That's what I told you. So first app component is loaded. While loading the app component, it has loaded class component. After that, it is loading the functional component. Any component can be loaded and rendered. Just we can write like this. So any number of components we can write here. So in application, as we said, Facebook contains almost 30,000 components there. So whatever the component they want, they will render it onto the page. Okay, a parent can invoke any number of child components. A parent can invoke any number of child components like this. But the thing here is, which component we have to use when? Which components we have to use when? First, when we take functional components. First, when we take functional components, what they say? They say is use as many functional components as possible. As many functional components as possible. Why? Because the reason is whenever we are working with the programming, functional components are functions are easier than classes. So because functions are easy to implement, functions are easier than classes. Suppose that they have provided you some option. While creating a component, you have choices. Like you can go with class component or functional component. If that component must be created as a class only, then there is no option. But they have given you a choice. You can create it using functional component or class component. Then what you can do? You can use as many functional components as possible just to go for a functional component because simple it is. Why functional component is easy to work? Because the main reason is absence of this keyword. Object-oriented programming when we take, if we are not that much efficient in object-oriented concepts, so implementation of them will become difficult. So that's why there is no this keyword available. There is no constructor available. So because these things are not provided, it's better to go with functional components. So that's why what they say, since these are easier to implement, they are also called stateless or presentational components. Most of the cases, functional components are used for presenting some data. Like display purpose, designing purpose, if you are using a component, it's better to go with. So that's where we can use functional components. They functional components means they do not involve what processing logic. So if you have some data available, then it is possible to process the data. But functional components, they won't provide any processing logic. If no data available, how I can modify, how I can process it? That's why if the concept is simple, just you are concentrating on presentation only, then better you go for class components. Then when we have to go for class components, why we have to go there? Because class components provide rich features. Rich features means what? Like constructors. Constructors, then we can say life cycle methods. Classes means one of the main advantage of a class is during the execution, the object of a class, it will move into different stages. From object creation to object destruction, the object, it will move into different stages. At each stage, we can specify a particular behavior. At each stage, we can specify a particular behavior. Means while initializing the object, so what should be done? Whenever there is some change in the data, what should be done? Or when the object is going to destroy, what should be done? Like that, different stages, we can do different implementations. That's what here. Now, when we see the class comp.js, so if I say RCFC, you can see a class component contains a constructor and different lifecycle methods provided. Mounting phase, updating phase, unmounting phase, like that different stages available. So at each stage, you can provide a different behavior. So life cycle methods will be there. Life cycle methods we can implement. Constructors will be there. This keyword. So no need to declare all data inside one function. In functional components, whenever you are writing some data inside a function, it will declared as local. So that local data not available to others. Object-oriented programming main advantage, data security, abstraction will be there, encapsulation will be there. So whatever the data members we declare inside the class, they can use it by all methods of that class set. That's the advantage. And generally, class components, they are used to write complex logics, where heavy coding is required, where plenty of data is maintained. There we can use class components. Class components, they maintain private data called state. Private data called state. And hence class components, they are also called stateful class components. They are also called stateful class components. Every class component will maintain its own local data, which is private to it, and that is what exactly we call state. Like every functional component is maintaining props, like every class component maintaining props. So in React, data is maintained in two different objects. One is prop, second one is state. What is the drawback of props? So props is immutable. So when you have some data with it, it cannot be modified. But generally data means depending on our requirement, the data should be updated dynamically. So for that purpose, class components, they provide the concept called state. So because they maintain their internal data called state, we call them stateful class components. Functional components, they won't maintain any state. So they are called stateless functional components. That's the difference. Stateless means no state object is maintained. Stateful means state object will be maintained. So to maintain state inside a functional component, to maintain state inside a functional component, React 16.8, in this version, they introduced a concept called hooks. React.js, it has introduced a concept called hooks. The main purpose of hooks is like how we maintain state inside a class component. In the same way, hooks allow the programmers to create state inside the functional component. So before the concept of hooks, what is the problem for programmers? What is the problem for programmers is, while building an application, you have to use both class and functional components. Simple logics means you are going for functional components. Complex logics means you are going for class components like that. But once the concept of hooks was introduced, you have completely two options. An entire project I can build using functional components, or the same project I can build entirely using class components. So that's why people who are not that much knowledge of object-oriented programming, they prefer functional components. Who have strong knowledge of object-oriented concepts, they will go for class components. So that's what. Once hooks was introduced, programmers completely two give options. Build the application entirely through functional components or through class components. Combining, it's not mandatory. So that is what the important thing they have provided. So state, starting from the React first version, class components, they are using state. But from 16.8 version onwards, functional components also, they started using the state. So what is this state and how to declare state inside a class component? And state is the data that can be modified dynamically. So how to modify that state data? One important thing in React, how to work with the state. We'll see this in the tomorrow session. So just try to practice the things, how to declare state and how to work with the state. All these implementations we'll see in the tomorrow's class.